Random thoughts. In this video, I'm going to discuss the use of rupees in East Africa. And I'm going to read a part of Sir Charles Eliot's book, The East Africa Protectorate, where he talks about currency in East Africa. But I'm also going to talk about how did it happen that rupees came to be used in East Africa as a currency. Now, Sir Charles Eliot was what was known as the Commissioner of British East Africa. And he was the topmost British official on the land that was known as the East Africa Protectorate. And this is the land that later on became the Kenyan colony and, of course, the Republic of Kenya. He served in that office from 1902 to 1904. He resigned and then he published this book. Now, this is a very detailed book that discusses different aspects of or different things about the protectorate, the land, the history, the people, the business, building of the railway. Very many things are discussed or are covered in this book, and it's a book I recommend you find time to read. Now, there is a part of the book where he talks about currency and the need for currency. Now, East Africa has had currencies for, we could say, thousands of years. Zanzibar had its own currencies, mostly coming from Muscat in Middle East. So currencies have been around for a while. But when the British came, they are the ones who introduced the rupees. But now you'll be wondering, why rupees are not pounds? Because these were British. They use pounds. They don't use rupees. But how did it happen that when they came to East Africa, the first currencies they introduced are the rupees? And in fact, the rupees left a huge mark in the local, you can call it consciousness, because most languages, Eastern African languages, especially in Kenya, most native languages, the name for money is actually rupee. If you talk to the Maasai, they will tell you robiani. The Kikuyu call it something similar. The Kisis call it something similar, like it's just a corruption of the word rupee. And the reason for that is that most of them, the first time they interacted with money for an extended period of time, and I mean currency, not money. There's a difference between money and currency. Money has always been with the people, but the currency, I'm talking about the currency. The first time they interacted with the coins, the currencies in coins, was the rupees that were brought by the British. And that's how they ended up calling every currency they see that a name that is close to the rupee. Now, why did the British introduce the rupee to East Africa? Why didn't they just bring the British pound? Before I talk about that, I'm going to read a part of the book where he talks about the currency in East Africa. This is what he says. Other questions of importance are the game laws, the currency, the construction of roads, and education. Of the game laws, I have said something elsewhere. The present currencies consist of rupees, annas, and pies, for which it is proposed to substitute the decimal system of Ceylon, that is, rupees and cents. This is certainly more logical and convenient than the present division of the rupee, but it may be questioned whether even more radical changes should not be made. The existing system was introduced because the chief foreign connection of East Africa was with India. And if that connection is to maintain its importance, the Ceylon coinage is probably the best. But if the dominant element in East Africa is not to be Indian but European, and if the connection with India is likely to lose its importance, the propriety of introducing British currency should, I think, be considered. In any case, the introduction of notes, if possible in terms of pounds sterling, is an urgent need on the account of the extreme inconvenience caused by a heavy coin of small value like the rupee to travelers and to those who wish to remit large sums by post. So that's what he says about that. In fact, he's basically saying maybe there is a need to introduce the pound into the East Africa Protectorate. At that point, of course, they are still using the rupee. Now, there are several reasons maybe why the rupee was convenient, because the rupee was a small unit money. And that was very convenient in a colony, in a place like East Africa, where there was need to pay the locals in very small amounts. But as he points out, that it was challenging for people carrying a lot of money or trading in a lot of money to use the rupees. But anyways, let's go back to the first question. Let's go back to the initial question. Why was the rupee used in East Africa? Of course, there is that reason that it is a small unit money. But why the rupee? Now, the rupee is something that the Imperial British East Africa copied from another company, and the company was the British East India Company. Now, here is something I found to be very interesting. The rupee was a currency that was mostly used during the reign of the Mughal dynasty in India. Now, the Mughal dynasty ruled India for a very long time, and they introduced the rupee. Now, the rupee was being used when the British East India Company went to India and started taking control of that country. And they decided to create their own rupee. They actually did not adopt the rupee as it were. They minted their own. Now, the British East India Company is this company that was similar to the Imperial British East Africa Company that went to India. It was a private entity actually, and it went to India and it took over that country and it started managing, basically colonizing that country. And this company was so huge, so powerful that it had its own army. It created its own currency. So the rupee was basically a private issued currency. It wasn't issued by a state, it was issued by a company. Now, this currency became, of course, very popular in India during the reign or during the time when this company ruled. And this company, we can say, ruled India from, we can say, late or mid 17th century up to late 19th century. So that's like close to over a little bit over 100 years. It took a while, and then at some point there were issues with the local people complaining, and then of course in 1870s the British government took over that country. Now, when the British took over, the company was basically dissolved. Now, the creation of the Imperial British East Africa Company is modeled to that. It was just a similar organization, or an organization that was built to be so exactly the same to that company. So it copied a lot of things from that company. But now here is something it did a little bit different. By the time this company is created and is coming to East Africa, there was a lot of trade between, of course, East Africa and India. And of course, the British government had established itself in India, so there was a lot of movement between India and Britain and India and East Africa. So that the British government, when it went to India, continued using the rupee. And when it started, or some of the British people formed this company and they came to East Africa, because there was already trade relationships, they decided to continue using the rupee as the currency. It was easier to use it. It was small money, small unit currency, we can say. And that's how they continued using it in East Africa. And of course, remember that it's most of the people who were used to build the railway line came from India. And of course, they were being paid with the rupee. And that's how they were being paid with the rupee. And then they spent the rupee here when they needed to. And that's how the currency got its it started being used locally. The company decided, rather than us creating our own currency, let's continue using what the British East India Company had created, and that's how the rupee came into the local market, and it was used. And now, when you read this part of the book, Sir Charles Eliot is wondering whether it was time to, of course, bring in the pounds, especially for people who were transacting huge amounts of money. So yeah, so the rupee was a privately issued currency. That's very interesting, at least initially. And it came to Kenya because the British had already established themselves in India and they had used that currency locally. And when they came to East Africa, they decided they were not going to reinvent the wheel. Those are my random thoughts.